This is E&P Reports from Editor and Publisher Magazine, the authoritative voice of news media since 1884, serving newspapers, broadcasts, digital, and all multimedia news publishing. And welcome once again, Mike Blinder, publisher of E&P Magazine. As always, housekeeping, listening to us on your favorite flavor of podcast channel. We urge you to follow us, watching me on your YouTube, I should say my YouTube channel. Below me, there is a subscribe button. To the right of that puppy is a bell. Smash it. You get an update each and every time we upload a new episode of E&P Reports. Dr. Andrew Conte. May I call you Doctor or Andy? Which do you prefer, sir?
Please call me Andy, yes.
Okay.
I'm not the useful kind of doctor, so.
Andrew Conte, Andy, it's an honor to have you on the show. You're the director for the Center for Media Innovation, got to get my mouth to work, at Point Park University. But you have a background, you have ink in your veins, sir, because before you got into all this think tank stuff and instructing and all that, you were at the Cincinnati Post, and then you were at the Pittsburgh Trib Review. And so you did a lot of investigative journalism in your past, correct, sir?
Yes, all the way back. I even worked with Jack Anderson, if you want to go all the way back. That was my first journalism job.
Jack Anderson? You don't look old enough for that.
Yeah.
I would rather not discuss your new book, I have no offense, which is, it's getting a lot of good reviews. It's called Death of the Daily News, where you really take a deep dive into how news deserts affect communities. But with your kind permissions and some kind of a football fan, can we just spend the entire time talking about your book, The Color of Sundays, where you talked about the Pittsburgh Steelers? Because that's the book I want to dive into. That must have been a fun one for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, The Color of Sundays was, for a Pittsburgh boy who grew up here rooting for the Steelers, it was really a dream come true to do a story about the Steelers and be with the team. And, and it really tells the bigger story of civil rights in the United States and the integration of American sports through football.
But this is not a show about football and sports. This is a show dedicated to news publishing. We have about 4,000 a month of news publishers, and we want to really get into your book, which is getting great reviews. I mean, there's a lot of people saying that you've got some pretty cool insights, because you not just talk about the death of journalism, you're talking about the communities it impacts. Am I right? And we want to get into that dialogue with you. Tell you what, hang in there. We'll get to that on the backside of this message.
This episode of E&P Reports is sponsored by IQ Audience Plus by Town News. Consumer revenue has never been more important. Digital leaders at media organizations worldwide are asking the same question. How do we accelerate the growth of consumer revenue? Traditional one-size-fits-all paywalls aren't the answer. They're blunt instruments that treat all visitors the same way, costing you money. IQ Audience Plus by Town News is a smart, dynamic metering solution that empowers you to maximize revenue by identifying key audiences, seeding engagement, and growing membership and subscriptions. Ready to supercharge your consumer revenue, grow engagement, and bolster your advertising income? Visit townnews.com/EP today to learn more about IQ Audience Plus by Town News.
All right, Andy, the book is called The Death of the Daily News, How Citizen Gatekeepers, I love that word, can save local journalism. First of all, let's start at 30,000 feet. What motivated you to write this? Why did you feel a need to start talking about how important local journalism is in the society today?
Well, I'm a local news guy, right? I mean, I grew up in local news, and I spent 15 years working in local news here in Pittsburgh at the Tribune Review. And so to me, that's where the excitement is, what's going on in your local community. And, we saw this massive disruption happening across our industry, as everyone knows, but particularly after 2007, when you had smartphones coming out, you had the Great Recession, and the whole country goes down. Everybody else comes back, but newspapers really don't come back. And so I started focusing on what are we going to do to not only sustain local news, but then to reinvent it and figure out what it looks like in the future. And so that's why we opened the Center for Media Innovation at Point Park University, which is a small private school in downtown Pittsburgh, because we wanted to focus on what is that, what are the pieces for innovative storytelling, of course, but also sustainability. How do we keep this going into the future?
But you're talking about the sustainability at the university more on the journalistic side. Does it really explore the business side? Because you just said it. The reason newsrooms aren't being financed like they used to is because, okay, if I may put my 2 cents in, as a guy who's been in this industry for 25 years from radio and TV, is we got fat and lazy. We were so into our 80% share of audience, we became distribution models for classifieds and inserts, and we really never built sustainable revenue streams that could survive the disruption. Do you explore that as well, or are you mostly working on the journalistic side to find economical and great ways to do local journalism? Tell me about the center. And
no, I think I think they're all tied together. I mean, you can't have one without the other now. And you're right. Our industry slept on, it had many decades, a century of rich revenues, and
right.
It's a great time to be a journalist. And after Watergate, you've got people going in excited to be journalists, and the money's just rolling in, and so we weren't really paying attention to it. And as an industry, we made a lot of mistakes that put us in a difficult spot when the whole technology changed. And so, yeah, I mean, it's got to be both things together. And to me, that's what's exciting about where we are now, because I think we went through obviously a period of massive pain. This disruption has, it's closed so many organizations, it's thrown so many journalists out of work or forced them to go do something else. But we're also starting to see some exciting things start to happen. And I think that's where I really wanted the book to focus, even though, it's got death in the title. It does talk about, bringing newspapers back to life, not newspapers, but news outlets back to life.
Yeah, it's funny. People want to shy away from the word newspaper. But I have a newspaper in my hometown of Tampa, Florida, owned by the Poynter Institute, that does not do print. It's complete, you know what I mean? 2 days a week it prints, and it's still a newspaper and says the words loud and proud. I am a magazine that only prints about 6,000 copies a month, but has an audience of over 75,000 when you look at social media, digital, email, and all that. So do you guys stop saying the word paper when you're thinking?
So in academia, people argue about, should we even say the word journalism? Is journalism a bad word? Because parents are like, you're not going to get a job in journalism. And the reality is, like, there's so many jobs out there now that we don't have enough journalists to fill them. And so I'm trying to preach that to parents all the time, because I get young people who come in and say, oh, I want to be a journalist. And the parents are like, well, there's no
money in that. No,
there's no money in that. Right. But if there is. I mean, there's money. People are surviving as journalists and as storytellers.
We're very Pollyanna here at E&P. Our cover a couple months ago was all about Report for America. Huge. We just saw hundreds of kids sitting on a lawn ready to dive into our industry. We like to say the word news publishing. If you're looking for, can I give it an academia guy some idea of? I mean, when I did my due diligence for E&P, I said, who is that executive that we're trying to attack with our journalists? Because that was the underserved, audience we wanted to get to. I said, news publisher. Someone who has to craft journalistic content. See, I put the word journalistic content there, has to find an audience for it, and has to monetize it. You see, and I put those three things under it. And then I don't care if it's paper, I don't care if it's digital, email like Axios, I don't care if it's surgical implants at birth, that they're talking to. It's those three things. Do you see where I'm getting? And if
so the young people that come in now, they don't even think of it in silos anymore. We always thought of it as like, oh, you're a print reporter, you're a TV reporter, you're a radio reporter, you're a photographer. To them, it's all like one thing. You're just doing storytelling. You're doing journalistic storytelling, and you use whatever tools are at your disposal to tell that story.
Okay, we're gonna turn the letter, Vanna, in a second and get into the content of the book. But I love discussing these high-level concepts, because one of the people who praised your book is Penny Abernathy, who was on this very program just last month after the big, we call it the Abernathy Report, because it was, she put out this amazing report that shows what we all know, but it has to sometimes be, metrics have to be applied so we all get it, that yes, communities are losing their voices. And that community then wanes, right? Without the voice. So let's define journalism first, because as you know, Andy, there's legislation going through Congress now that hopefully, we're very much behind it, will get big tech to compensate the publishers for content, just like composers get compensated for music. There's antitrust lawsuits going against big tech right now. There is interesting philanthropy models starting up. I mean, I just spoke at the the Colorado Press, and they're discussing the Green Bay Packer model now, where you sell shares. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yeah. It should be that, because really the news belongs to all of us now, right? Like we've democratized the news so that everyone's a content creator now. Everyone who has, smartphones and tablets, they're putting out information, but they don't really think of it in that way. And so to me, that's part of what we need going forward, is that we've got to convince the public that social media matters. Like you put out a tweet, like it's not just some ephemeral thing. It's part of your community's conversation. And so then once you recognize that that matters, then we've got to work at helping people do a better job of it. And you mentioned Penny Abernathy. Penny's been a terrific colleague, and I've loved working with her. And so what I've tried to do is complement her work. She gives you that sort of nationwide view that says, here's where all the news deserts are going, where they're growing. And what I tried to do with the book was to go into one of those places and say, okay, what happens in one of those communities?
And document it. So before we turn that letter, let's stay on that journalism in the youth. When I interviewed the Pulitzer Prize winning team in Minneapolis that broke the George Floyd story, these were the editors. Remember, they broke that story during a pandemic. So they had to do it remotely. And then they have reporters now, going into places where bullets are flying. So they have lawyers involved. And I asked them how they felt about keeping their head in the game with all the cable news stuff going on around them. The left versus the right. You could call it the news echo chambers, whatever. And their response was, "What's cable news? We don't listen."
Oh,
are the kids of today understanding that journalism is not opinion? When you're doing this think tank environment in Pittsburgh, how are you approaching this weird world we're in right now? Because Chris Steyerwalt was just on the program before you, the guy that called Arizona for Fox and got fired. I mean, where are you? Yeah. I'm looking at tomorrow. I'm 65, man. I'm out of here. They're talking about me being the next, obit. I mean, where is the future?
There are two distinct groups. When I look at young people today, there is still the group of young people who say, we just want to tell the stories. We want to do it objectively. We want to, let's just go find the truth. But there's also a group of young people that come in saying, we have strong opinions. We want to tell stories, but we're going to tell them from our point of view. And, we're going to use the same tools. We want to learn how to do this, but we have an opinion, a subjective direction behind our work, and so there's definitely two camps. And I just think what we really tell the subjective ones, the ones who want to have an opinion, just be clear about it. Where are you coming from, and be transparent about what your motives are.
But they don't come in there worshiping Rachel Maddow and Tucker Carlson. I'm not saying anything negative about them. I'm just saying that's what they.
No, I've not heard anyone do that. No, they come in worshiping TikTok. And I asked them, so that where were you when the Queen died? And in my class, I have a class of first year students. And they're like, well, I found out from TikTok because all these memes started popping up. Like, wow, mind blown, right? And that's pretty incredible. So. I was with a bunch of journalists when it happened, and they were like, "Oh, we found out from the Associated Press." So, there's a difference.
A complete difference. Yeah, mine was an alert from CNN or something, and then I'm now learning that a reel is the most important way to put a story together. But let's now get into the book. I love the city because I know the city that you kind of one of them. You talk about the city of McKeesport in southwestern Pennsylvania. Talk about McKeesport. What is it? To those that don't understand McKeesport, it's truly like America, is it not? It's just...
McKeesport's really a lovely community. It's a place. It's really the heart of what we call the Monongahela River Valley, or the Mon River Valley, and that was where, when people say Pittsburgh's a steel town, that's what they're talking about. A lot of the steel mills were there. The iron ore was there. There's still U.S. Steel has a big coke plant there, and the only remaining steel mill is nearby. And so McKeesport was this thriving center of industry where it had multiple department stores. G.C. Murphy's, their national headquarters, was there. It was actually based in McKeesport. This was a place that just sort of had everything. And people talk about, people would walk down the streets. The streets were packed on Friday nights with all these shoppers, and Saturdays. And suddenly, people know the story, in the 1980s, the whole industry collapsed and the bottom fell out. And so McKeesport now is still, it was a community at one point that had about 50,000 residents, and now it's got fewer than 20,000. And, the newspaper was right at the heart of the community in many ways, like literally at the heart of the community. And as I found out through my research, it was also, figuratively right at the heart of the community.
Now, McKeesport lost its paper 2015. Did anyone jump in and fill? See, I always say, because when you read, okay, I'm going to get into some real metaphors here. When you read the Abernathy report, you realize that when a news desert occurs, people become thirsty. You see what I'm doing here? I'm tying it together.
Yes. Good.
And they get thirsty for news. So then unreliable sources kind of get in, you know what I mean? They start reading other stuff because they're begging for something. I need news now. I lost it.
Yeah.
what happened in McKeesport? Did it
So
start?
it's a mix, so first you have to understand what the daily news was for this community in the first place. This was a newspaper that had at one point, more than a dozen reporters that were covering every aspect of the city. And, there were multiple reporters covering City Hall and all the different zoning boards. And so all that goes away. And you're right. I mean, in the vacuum, then there are lots of things that crop up. And I think that's one of the big lessons for us to take away, is that the future of local storytelling is not one monolithic organization, but lots of little ones. So in McKeesport, you had, anticipating that the news was sort of going away, you had this local person started up an online news site, and that's still there. And then you had, there was a group of entrepreneurs who bought a local newspaper 20 miles down the river, and they opened a bureau in McKeesport. But then you had citizens themselves just trying to figure out what's going on, and they just start talking to the people around them, like people have always done. They just start asking, well, what have you heard? And places like your local church or the butcher shop or the salon or the barber, those become places where people come together and they start telling stories about the community and trying to figure out what's going on, whether it's, hey, did you hear so-and-so died? Or did you hear that the garbage collection days have changed, or whatever it is. And oftentimes those sources of information, there's good information there, but it gets twisted and it gets confusing, and people get overwhelmed, and they start to feel like they're confused about their community, and they start to feel like it's all the information is overwhelmingly negative.
Another plant that grows. I can't get away from these metaphors, please excuse me. In that desert environment, tends to be graft, tends to be again, I'm going to get very ethereal here, but in a Madisonian democracy, we had imperfect men write a perfect document that put the final check on power in the power of the free, unfettered press, right? And that these were brilliant men who knew that if we could not control media, that media had to be independent and had to constantly be the watchdog for the community. What happened in McKeesport when that final check on power went away? Did it start to become a little more, how should I say, less whatever?
Well, the balance of power tipped. It was interesting. A lot of the lawmakers in McKeesport were very forthcoming with me, and I was really grateful for that. And they, what happened was at the very beginning, some of them were like, well, the newspaper's gone. This is great. They've been asking us all these difficult questions. Nobody's going to be asking us difficult questions anymore. This is terrific. But then they realized within the first year that, well, for every negative story the newspaper told, or challenging story, not even a negative story, but a story that challenged their narrative, the newspaper was also telling all these other stories that enhanced their narrative, that we tore down a building because I went out and got this money from, some state grant, and we were able to do all these things. All that went away, and they were no longer able to communicate as easily. But then what happened after that then was that's where the balance of power really tipped, because you find out that these public officials have access to means to reach the entire community, whether it's email or robocalls or, the mailers that they send out, and they start to drive the narrative in the community. But, one of the lawmakers that I talked with was very self-aware, and he said, we do that. I feel like I've become a source of information in my community, but I'm not a journalist. I don't come at it from the perspective of a journalist. I come at it from my perspective as a politician working in this community.
It's funny that, I become very sad when I watch people. Okay, my wife tells me to stay off social media, but I can't. I have to see what people are saying. Does that make sense? Of all
shapes and stripes. I heard that a lot. I heard that a lot. Yeah. Because
it depresses me. And there are actually people that belong to the church we belong to that read articles about the death of newspapers and go, yay, because they lean very far right. Do you understand? And in their minds, journalism, like I keep saying, we have to find news publishing. That's the term I try to use.
It's not a bad word. You can say journalism.
Journalism is the Washington Post. You see what I'm saying? It's the New York Times, the people, which in my opinion aren't local news. They're brands, they're CNN, they're MSNBC. It's not what we're discussing here now. And that's not what E&P tries to. Yeah, of course, we interviewed Rex Hupke at USA Today because you have to. These are great people. Sure, but you also have to focus on the little stories about the communities where journalism happens. What what say you in McKeesport? Were there some people that were just, thank God they're gone because they were biased? Was any of that going on?
Yeah, of course. At the very beginning, I think there were people who were like, yes, this is great. The newspaper's gone. But then but the thing was, people don't realize what the newspaper does for them, that they don't consider. I talk about it in the book in sort of academic terms, this idea of social capital, the networks that we build amongst each other when we find out about what's going on around us, that we find out what the kids are doing in school, or we find out who's being born and who's dying, or we find out, when the local church is having a fish fry, and all these opportunities for gathering in our community and the things that bring us together. And when that's gone, people really, they're lost. They really don't know, like, how do I find out what's happening in my community? And, McKeesport's also a place where the school superintendent talks in the book about how, I think about half the students either don't start in the district at the beginning of the year, or they leave before the year's out. And so it's a transient community. Yeah. And he talks about how, the newspaper was a great place where you could for, $1 a day, buy a newspaper and quickly learn what's going on in the community and become part of the community. And now you come in and you're like, well, I've got all these different sources, and how do I figure it out?
It's funny, when I was hosting this big luncheon panel this week in, this is a recording, so it might be a few weeks, but at the time of this recording, I had just come back from Colorado hosting a big luncheon at Colorado Press Association, where we had a panel discussion about media and all that and more. One of the things that was said was, from public broadcasting, is we do a great job of informing our audience on our value. They kept saying, we do that all the time. How valuably, what would your life be like without Sesame Street? You see, what would your life like be? And then they said, you guys do a crappy job of informing your audience about your value. And over the decades, we haven't done. For example, when someone says to me that that's the paper, I say, wait a second. The good thing about us in this industry is we separate opinion and journalism. You see what I'm saying? We're good at that. Here's the journalism, which is all bias. You agree, right? We're not robots.
Hard to be objective, right? Yeah.
I mean, but a good journalist sources it, right, and gets different sides of the argument.
You attempt to be objective, but
if we were all some form of algorithm, then maybe we could, But that's okay. We at E&P know there's bias. We don't like lying. We like, but we get the bias. We're okay with that. The point is, it just gets to a point where people don't understand the value, that this is not a biased product. This is a journalistic entity that does spit out some editorial every now and then. And that editorial tends to taint the brand in some people's minds. Do you agree? Was that finally realized when it's gone, that fear of loss, that loss aversion? I mean, they say the best way for someone to appreciate something is to have fear of loss. Does that make sense? Do they now understand in this community that, wow, we're sorry it went?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, they realized that right away. I mean, as soon as the newspaper stopped publishing, within the first...
Even those that disagreed terribly with
everybody,
ownership.
Everybody I talked with, that they realized right away that the newspaper was doing things for the community that they didn't realize, they weren't aware of. And it was the things that, the small things that, you sort of take for granted. But that, we go back through history, that these are the things that social scientists have identified newspapers as always doing, that they bring people together and they inform big groups of people. And, the other important thing to remember here is that, that McKeesport it falls within the city of, not within the city of Pittsburgh, but within the Pittsburgh's, coverage area. So
right.
There's TV news. There's, you've got both the Tribune Review and the Post Gazette are still telling regional stories. You've got the Mon Valley Independent, is this newspaper that is down the river and now, has an office in McKeesport. But the thing is, that's the misconception about news deserts too, is people think, well, this is a place where it's just completely devoid of news. The reality is, like, news still happens, first of all. And second of all, there just isn't enough coverage of it. It's not, you don't have enough people there telling the stories. And so, TV news will come in whenever somebody gets murdered or there's a house, but they don't tell the stories about, what happens at the council meeting, or what happens when, the kids do an art project at school, or the local Little League does some cool thing on the field. Those are the kinds of stories that disappear. And that's what people get frustrated with.
Of course, because that's what it's all about. I mean, again, it's not we love the Washington Post, New York Times, and even the Wall Street Journal. It doesn't matter. But the local voice, when it has Penny Abernathy in her report and all the other research out there reinforces, when that local voice goes away, the desert becomes just barren, and there's so many issues. So let's bring this thing home. We only have a few more minutes left in our journey, sir. What's the solution? I love this, but you also say the answer resides in the public truly understanding the value of knowing about their community. So there's an answer here, or is it your book's not all negative, right? It's not all doom and gloom.
No. It's not at all. I think it's actually hopeful. I think we're moving to a hopeful space, and and part of it involves journalists. I think journalists have a new job, a new role that in the past was maybe looked down upon, but something that we need to elevate and celebrate. This idea that journalists need to be on the front lines of telling local news. And this is the big and, because it's something that we really have not wanted to do for a long time in journalism, is work with the people who consume the news, right? Work with citizens to help them do a better job of figuring out what's going on in their community, telling us what's going on in the community, or sharing with us the news. I think the role of journalists going forward is as much not going out and just telling people what the news is, but listening to people and hearing from them, like what are the things that they care about, and then what are the things that are going on in their community, and helping them stay within the guidelines. Once we all acknowledge that these sources that we're getting our news from are important, that social media is important, where we get our information, then we need to do a better job of it. And journalists are uniquely prepared to help citizens do a better job of it, to tell them, hey, that's bias. You need to identify it as bias. This is, you've only got part of the story. Go back and get it. Or, you put this information out on tweet, you tweeted it out, or you put it on Facebook, or you're telling people and you haven't verified it. Journalists can play an important role to lift up this whole thing. And I think it's also a good business model as well, because you're going to reach places that you can't reach otherwise. And you're going to be able to, sell your product there as well.
I don't know. Do you know Mike Barnacle or know him? He was on this very program just recently, and you're channeling him. Did you know? I mean, remember, he's like the old man of journalism. He's been around writing columns, and he's been in this. He wrote speeches for Bobby Kennedy, right? We're discussing a guy that's been there for a while, and he basically said the same thing. He said, "We're all running around so quick, we don't know how to tell a story." And if I said, Michael, I'm buying you a newspaper today. You're now the editor-in-chief. I'm bribing you. Go in there. He said, I just tell everyone to take a breath and listen. I think you're channeling that. Is that how you're pretty much telling people storytelling, right? The right way.
It is. And the funny thing is, we've done such a good job within our industry, journalism, saying that what we do is special and different, that people don't feel like when they tell stories that they have value. And it's almost like we need to deputize the public and say, give you a badge and say, okay, yeah, you're in your community. You're telling stories. These stories have value. You're creating content. You're doing journalism. Oh no, that bad word. You're actually doing it, and it has value and it has meaning. And so, because you're doing it and it has value and meaning, you need to do a better job of it. You need to take a step and say, is this really true? Did I verify this? Did I ask somebody, or is this just what I think is true? And or is this just my opinion?
You're verifying something that we're discovering, which is not a discovery at E&P. I do this speech now, mostly on the business side, and I've done it at 16 state associations this year. I call it Stop Overthinking, Just Do It, where I think we all get caught in the weeds, but every success that we promote here at E&P of a great journalistic entity, they're just going back to basics, Andy. You get that? It's not overthinking it. They're not getting so caught up in, is it TikTok versus this social media versus that? How many they're just telling good journalistic stories. And guess what? People are reading them.
And I think the other thing that's being lost is that people do care. That people, we talked about how there were the people who celebrated when the newspaper closed. But there were also people who stepped up, with their resources and said, "Oh yeah, we want to step into this void and create something." And those guys from the Mon Valley Independent, which is the newspaper that was based in Menneson downriver, and they took their own money and said, we want to create something. We don't want a community that doesn't have a newspaper. And so that's the other part. We've always talked about this from a deficit narrative, but we need to think about it from the resource side, that there are lots of cool resources out there. We just need to nurture them and help them do a better job of what they're doing.
It is a sobering cover, but it's a book I've only gotten through a few chapters because I really wanted to get you on the program. But the cover is more sobering than the content, if I may, because I'm sure you had an editor that we got to get this thing sold because it says death in red letters. The death of the daily news, how citizen gatekeepers can save local journalism is written by Andrew Conte. We call him Andy on this program, PhD, Director of Center for Media Innovation at Point Park University. I promise you, if you go to Google and just look for Andrew Conte, you'll find the book. But if you go back to editorandpublisher.com/vodcast, you'll see a link to the book as well. Andy, final thoughts to our audience of news publishers. Anything else you want to add?
Just that I think it's time to realize that we've all been given this incredible gift, right? We live at a super exciting time. It's been a time with a lot of challenges, but I think there's a lot of positives ahead, and we need to lean into those.
We agree as well. You stay well. Good luck with the book, and thank you so much for being part of our world today.
Thanks, Mike.